You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have a pretty explosive update as far as this ongoing news scandal is concerned, where Donald Trump relented on his $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS, settling instead for a $1.7 billion slush fund to give out to his insurrectionists. But there is something buried within that new deal that's garnering a lot of attention right now. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, Brian, Donald Trump just negotiated with himself because he is the head of the Department of Justice. He is the all-powerful Article 2 Emperor of the United States. Remember, he's the one who said Article 2 says I can do anything I want, and he is now proving that, or at least testing its limits. He's just granted himself and his family members and his businesses complete and absolute immunity against ever being audited. And I'm going to read a little clip from this new addition or addendum to the settlement agreement that Donald Trump approved for himself yesterday. They've just tacked on another provision. So, you know, with all of this, Brian, I'm beginning to feel like Donald Trump may be...
Excuse me, sir, how old were you when you made your first million?
What is this for?
We're trying to get advice for the younger generation.
I made my first million last year, actually.
Corrupt. I'm not entirely...
I don't know what it is. There's just something creeping in that might give that indication.
I have a sneaking suspicion he's not on the up and up. You know, when I read this, Brian, I swear, I lost my mind for a minute. And I thought, you know, it would be so easy to just quit, just disengage, just give up because of the tsunami of crime and corruption that washes over us every day. And then, you know, I thought back to Richard Nixon and Watergate. And you know what? When Nixon and his corrupt administration officials and his criminal associates were kind of in the midst of committing those Watergate-related crimes, I'll bet they were feeling themselves. I bet they felt bulletproof, like there was nobody who was going to touch them. And then what happened? 48 of them were convicted of crimes. 30 of them went to prison. Brian, that is going to look like small potatoes when we deal with the accountability that must come to Trump and his criminal associates, both in and out of government. So, you know, I just decided to double down and let this continue to energize me and work toward that accountability mission. But let me just read for our viewers a little bit of this new agreement that Donald Trump just struck with himself, you know, against the American people and the American taxpayers. And it basically says that the United States of America is hereby forever barred and precluded from prosecuting or pursuing any and all claims or causes of action, whether presently known or unknown to the United States of America, that could have been asserted against Trump and against his family members and his businesses. He gets a complete pass for any and all matters currently pending or that could ever be pending, including tax returns filed before today. In other words, this is not quite cradle to the grave immunity for all tax crimes he may have committed, but sort of cradle to today in the 80 years that Donald Trump has been on this planet. And that is basically what this one-page addition gives Donald Trump. He has given himself and his family and his businesses complete insulation against ever having a tax audit being performed on them for anything they have ever done from the time they were born until today, the effective date of this agreement. Now, as outrageous as that sounds, if there is any silver lining here, Brian, you know, I was taught in law school a very long time ago that judges can and should strike down any agreement that is reached that is, and here are the magic words, void as against public policy. And I don't want to turn this into a law school class, but let me just read a little snippet of what the law provides about an agreement like the one I just read. The legal doctrine of void as against public policy dictates that courts will refuse to enforce agreements or legal provisions that undermine the public welfare, violate established law, or subvert the administration of justice. That's just a little flavor of the legal doctrine of void as against public policy. I have to believe any jurist, any judge worth his or her salt would throw this thing out, would invalidate this if a legal challenge were brought against it so quick it would make Trump's head spin. So, you know, these battles are not over. These battles are just beginning. And the way I see it, Donald Trump must know that he's going to lose Congress in a landslide in the midterms. And now he is trying to grab all of the sort of criminal gains he can collect up for himself, recognizing that he is not long for power.
Glenn, I have a bunch of questions here, but the first is not necessarily about this deal in particular, but does the president have any authority or power to have a deal negotiated and for it to stand even after he's out of power? So what I mean is, like, for example, on this Board of Peace, this International Board of Peace, he handed down this edict that he was chairman for life. He's only the president right now, and so after he's no longer president, what weight does his authority carry, or does his word carry as a private citizen to continue serving on the Board of Peace, or to continue having this corrupt deal struck where the IRS can't audit any of his finances?
Excuse me, sir, how old were you when you made your first million?
What is this for?
We're trying to get advice for the younger generation.
I made my first million last year, actually.
What line of work are you in?
I'm in sales.
Okay, what's the best advice you can...
Brian, rather than give you an answer and then give you all the caveats to that answer, I'm going to give you the caveat up front. The caveat is nobody has any fucking idea, because the courts, the United States judicial system, has never run up against an abjectly, openly, notoriously criminal president who is trying to make himself king for all times and all purposes in perpetuity, forever and ever. Amen. So there is no court precedent you can point to say, well, last time the courts had to deal with this, here is the way they ruled, and that has now set precedent. But I think now the answer, given the caveat, is nobody flipping knows. The answer is, I don't think the courts will say a president, once he has attained that status, right, can do whatever he wants for all time in perpetuity. He can grant himself powers beyond the time he serves as president of the United States. He can grant his family members all sorts of immunity against tax audits. He can protect and shield his businesses, and they can have been run as criminal organizations for as long as he wants. And the federal government can never touch them, because Donald Trump said while he was president, the federal government can never touch them. I just don't think there is any lawful precedent. There's certainly no statute on the books that would provide for that. There is no precedent in courts of appeals that would provide for that. So I think the best answer is no, he doesn't have that power. But, you know, unless and until the Supreme Court says, duh, he doesn't have that power, we are always at risk. Given that we have a compromised majority on the Supreme Court, we are always at risk that they will create out of whole cloth, and contrary to the express terms of the Constitution, additional presidential powers, you know, that we didn't know existed, like presidential immunity. That doesn't exist either in our history. It doesn't exist in any precedent. It doesn't exist as a federal statute, but a majority of the Supreme Court justices decided to conjure it up out of whole cloth. So, you know, all of these questions are unanswerable. You know, we can certainly talk about how they should be answered, but, you know, with the Supreme Court, I think all bets are off.
Glenn, it's worth asking here, if Donald Trump is making it a point to include a provision as part of this deal that he can't be audited, is that not a tacit admission that there is some wrongdoing happening here. Like, you don't need to strike a deal to say, hey, don't look over there if nothing is actually going on over there. But the fact that he did make this provision part of the deal suggests to anybody who's acting in good faith that there is something going on there. And so could this be used as part of a future federal government, not just to refuse to abide by the terms of this bogus deal, but in fact, as justification to go in harder for him, because he's basically just said, hey, it's really important that nobody look at my finances anymore.
Yeah, Brian, there you go talking sense. You know, and the good news is I think the rules of evidence actually support you in that common sense view of how these statements could be used, how this, you know, benefit he's just granted to himself could be used against him in a court of law. There's something called a statement of a party opponent. What does that mean? It means once you're a defendant in a criminal case, and Donald Trump will be in the future, undoubtedly, he will again be a defendant in probably multiple criminal cases. Anything he says, anything he posts, any provision he negotiated for himself can be introduced as evidence against him, as a statement of a party opponent. Let me use another example. You know, if somebody was like, listen, I don't want the cops investigating me for bank robbery. Don't investigate me for bank robbery. You know, I'm going to take a guess that guy may have robbed the bank, right?
Yeah.
Donald Trump has now negotiated himself an agreement that will not be upheld by any court, I predict, other than the 6-justice, right-wing majority on the Supreme Court. He's negotiated an agreement that says, don't investigate me, don't audit me. Don't look at my tax returns. Don't look at my businesses. Don't look at my family's tax filings. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Well, you know what? I think he's probably played some games on the tax front. And those statements, this negotiated agreement that will be void as against public policy, I believe, can be used as an admission, as a statement of a party opponent, as incriminating evidence against Donald Trump.
You know, you had mentioned the Supreme Court, and I actually think that's important because to what extent would you be concerned that even if you have judges in federal or circuit courts that are acting in good faith and upholding the law, that ultimately you have a Supreme Court that's perfectly willing to, strike this down if it means that their God King can have a little bit more protection?
Eat this one thing to clear brain fog. Let me explain. This isn't your typical...
Yeah, so we've got the rot at the top of the federal judiciary. Trial court judges have held strong. Courts of appeals, for the most part, have held strong. And yet you've got those 6 compromised Supreme Court justices, some more compromised than others, who, for whatever reason, seem unwilling to put the constraints that the Constitution provides on this president. I don't understand why that is. I think they're cutting off their nose to spite their face because, once Donald Trump reaches dictator status, and he is dangerously close to reaching that status right now, we know that Congress, in the control of the Republicans, have abdicated their responsibility to provide any oversight, to be a check or a balance against any form of presidential executive branch corruption. Once he attains that status, a dictator has no use for a Supreme Court. Inferior courts are just fine, but the Supreme Court justices might find themselves in a very tight spot if they actually just allow Donald Trump to fully become the dictator he so desperately wants to become. So, I am always concerned about what the Supreme Court might do. Now, listen, they have pushed back a little bit recently on tariffs and in some other arenas. Maybe they are coming to realize that their own position, their own power is perhaps going to erode, if not be taken away entirely, if they continue to let Donald Trump become the dictator he so desperately wants to become. But, at this point, you wonder, what more can Donald Trump do? A dangerous question, given what he's already done. But it seems like next, he might just tell his executive branch officials, whether DOJ officials or maybe military members, listen, just back the truck up to Fort Knox, unload all of our government's wealth into that truck, deliver it to me and my family members, and then we'll call it a day. And of course, I have absolute immunity, and I will pardon everybody who, drives that truck and, acquires all of America's wealth for me. I'll pardon you all, so everybody gets away completely free with this caper. It seems like there is nothing beyond Trump's, appetite for crime and corruption that is too wild or fanciful. But, he just seems to be walking us all in that direction.
Well, we will, of course, stay on top of this issue. For those who are watching right now, if you'd like to follow along with all legal news, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. I'm going to put those links right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. If you're not yet subscribed, it's 100% free to do so, but a great way to support our work. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Glen Kirchner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.
Eat this one thing to clear brain fog. Let me explain. This isn't your typical herbal book. It's a manual.